Former Prime Minister of Bangladesh Sheikh Hasina is today being sentenced to death by a Bangladesh tribunal. Former Prime Minister of Bangladesh Sheikh Hasina, who was unseated through a student revolution in Bangladesh, is today being sentenced to death by a Bangladesh tribunal. This verdict is extremely significant. I will go into all the details through this video. I'll explain to you why such a verdict had to come about, what it means really for Bangladesh, for the future of Bangladesh in terms of governance, whether the entire dynamics of Bangladesh politics will now change, and why this matters to India. Why should we be bothered if there is a death sentence verdict to Sheikh Hasina? By the way, questions of extradition have already come in, whether she is in exile in India and whether Indian authorities will now have to get proactive in getting started with the extradition process. All those questions remain. Let me give you the full story. But before that, you're watching Free Press Journal on YouTube. Do like, share and subscribe to this channel to get authentic inputs on international stories. So here's how everything started, and here's why this verdict is important. On the 17th of November 2025, a tribunal under the International Crimes Tribunal Bangladesh, or ICTBD, in Dhaka sentenced former Bangladeshi Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina to death, finding her guilty of crimes against humanity tied to a violent crackdown on student-led protests in mid-2024. This is a landmark in multiple senses. A former head of government is being held criminally liable for atrocity-type charges in Bangladesh, signaling a decisive symbolic break with the past where such accountability was rare. The case stems from the 2024 July uprising of students and other protesters, and the tribunal's verdict emphasizes that the state response crossed the threshold into quote-unquote systematic and coordinated violence, including use of drones, helicopters, and lethal weapons. Beyond the individual, this ruling potentially transforms Bangladesh's political landscape. It casts the ousted regime not merely as politically defeated, but as criminally culpable. And the shift alters norms of governance, opposition, and justice. In short, this is not just another corruption trial. It touches on the very legitimacy of state coercion, the rule of law, and the future balance of power in Bangladesh. What does it mean for Sheikh Hasina? Well, for Hasina personally, the implications are stark. Physically, she remains in exile, reported to be in India, and now faces a death sentence in absentia. Politically, the verdict erodes her moral and political authority. For decades, she was the dominant force in Bangladeshi politics. Now, her legacy is under legal and historical scrutiny in a dramatic way. Strategically, her options narrow down. She may attempt to mount a resistance from abroad, appeal for international sympathy, mobilize her party base, but the ruling severely limits her ability to lead as before. Why should India care? Bangladesh is India's immediate neighbor in the east. Political upheaval, crackdown, exile of a leader, and mass mobilizations all carry the risk of border spillover, migrant flows, and security externalities that India cannot afford to ignore. It also becomes a precedent for democratic norms and rule of law in South Asia. India often positions itself internally and externally as a democracy and rule of law upholder. Developments in Bangladesh, if they lead to broad suppression of opposition or selective justice, could reflect upon India's regional narrative and its soft power. India has for years invested in its relationship with Bangladesh as part of its regional policy. For example, connectivity, trade, maritime links, counter-China calculus. The sudden fall from power of a long-time leader with whom India had deep ties compels a recalibration of India's Bangladesh strategy. India, of course, has major infrastructure, energy, trade and connectivity links with Bangladesh. A steady, predictable Bangladesh is in India's interest. In final analysis, India cannot treat this as someone else's problem. The ruling in Dhaka affects New Delhi's strategic horizon, requires deliberated diplomacy, and demands foresight on managing a fallout, political, security, and economic. For Bangladesh, what it means going forward is a power shift and an opposition vacuum. It means that the upcoming elections in Bangladesh, scheduled for 2026, will likely be contested under a new reality. It also means that the student movement that toppled Hasina reflected deeper discontent among younger Bangladeshis. How the next government responds to youth's demands, governance reform, accountability, and socio-economic aspirations will be central. Thus, the verdict is not an endpoint but a hinge. Bangladesh enters a transitional zone where governance, politics, and justice are being renegotiated. Well, with that, one must understand that here is a leader who has been, in fact, a good friend to India. And the current leadership in Bangladesh is not exactly in best of terms. Rather, we have had a bit of hostility with the current leadership of Muhammad Yunus in Bangladesh. And that said, the verdict of death sentence and the fact that there is a not so friendly government in Bangladesh, what it would mean in terms of India's foreign policy in its immediate neighborhood, is a story we will continue to track. Do like, share and subscribe to Free Press Journal. Thanks for watching. Put in your comments on what you think of this highly controversial verdict of death sentence to Sheikh Hasina.